All right, so warm welcome from my side. Simon Koschut. I will be the moderator today, and also one of the speakers. I want to send a warm welcome to everyone. We have a good crowd of people. If I can see this, about 77 people are joining us, so that's great. That there's such a good crowd. We're looking forward to a debate, a discussion on the emotional turn in IR. So. Without further ado, I will just quickly start with introducing our speakers today, and on the emotional turn in international relations, how emotions have shaped the field. And we'll go not in the order as originally planned, but we'll go in the opposite order. So we'll start today with Katarina Kinnvall from Lund University in Sweden. She's a scholar of emotions, identity, and security, ontological security in international relations, and with a particular expertise on the interplay between affect, migration, and global political dynamics. And if I remember correctly, also on emotional contestation. So warm welcome, Katarina. Thanks for joining us. Um, Next in line will be Erica Resende from Brazil, joining us from hot Rio de Janeiro in this case. Bit jealous there from cold Germany here. So Erica is a leading scholar on trauma, memory, and affect in international relations, and she has also focused on emotions shaping political narratives and practices. So very happy to have you with us today as well. And third in line, we have Andrew Ross, who's a professor at Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore, USA. He's the author of Mixed Emotions Beyond Fear and Hatred in International Conflict, and also, together with myself, the co-editor of the recently published Handbook of Emotions in IR, coming out with Oxford, I think in January, right, Andrew? If I'm correct, remember correctly. And he has been exploring the complexity of emotions in global politics and security studies, and also, I think, digital emotions, if I remember correctly, is also something that and populism is also something you've been interested in. I know you've been working on this with Ty as well, so um, looking forward to that work coming out soon. And myself, I'm Simon Koschut. I'm a professor of international security at Zeppelin University in Germany at Lake Constance. And I work mainly on emotional dynamics in security politics and peace and conflict studies. Um, right. And so we've got even more people joining us now. Now we're up to 92. Okay, wow. That's fantastic. Okay, so we thought that I gave everyone a set of questions to start with, and we'll have each person speaking for about five-ish minutes, and then we'll open the floor for questions and comments from the audience, hopefully a lot of them. So we'll just go ahead with starting with Katarina. So Katarina, the floor is all yours.
Thank you so much, Simon, and thanks for inviting me for today, both of you, Simon and Andrew, and also for putting the handbook together, which I'm really looking forward to seeing in print. So I'm really happy to be here. And one of Simon's first questions to us as a panel was how the emotional term has reshaped our own thinking and research trajectories in IR. And to me, this is quite a difficult question, as I think a lot of my early work was focused on emotions long before this turn, especially if we think of this turn as taking place in the early 2000s. And I think it also probably says something about IR's preoccupation with turns as well, which we may come back to. So when I started my doctorate in 1989, I took a course in cognitive theory, which introduced me to what has later been referred to as the first generation of foreign policy analysis, where some of the more influential authors were Irving Janis' studies of groupthink, Deborah Larson's application of cognitive psychology to American Cold War policies, Alexander Georgi's development of operational codes and cognitive limits to rational decision-making, and Jervis, Lebeau, and Stein's systematic analysis of perception and misperception in international politics. So these studies were all focused on the psychological dimension of IR, but perhaps prioritized the cognitive over the emotional and the affective. At the same time, during this time, there was also growth in feminist IR, with feminist scholars of the 80s and the 90s strongly questioning the separation of reason and emotions in IR theory. So this focus on emotions challenged the tendency to keep emotions and rationality separate, and acknowledged the fact that the concept of rationality is itself imbued with both emotional and normative understandings. So this, I think, also constitutes my initial introduction to the larger field of international relations, as well as political psychology, actually, with my dissertation at the time focusing on the Tiananmen massacre in 1989, trying to understand the psychological and cultural dynamics of authoritarianism in a Chinese context. So of particular interest at this time was how political structures and cultures work on people's minds, and how they cannot be absolved from either their structural preconditions or their psychoanalytical dynamics. So together with others interested in the psychological dynamics of IR at the time, this basically meant the resistance to political science and IR focused on individualism, rationalism, quantitative methodology, instead exploring the post-structural, post-colonial, gendered, and later the psychoanalytical foundations of politics and international relations. And I think this is also where I see one of the more interesting conceptual, methodological, empirical contributions to emotion research in IR, going beyond the realist, liberal, constructivist debates, the states as a person narratives, to investigate the emotional dynamics of conflict, wars, and governance. And I think this also became key to the emotional turn in IR, in which IR political theory incorporated and interacted with affect and emotions, with passions, love, hate, trauma, despair, anxiety, and insecurity, but also with institutions. So in my own work, I've been specifically indebted to the works of Anthony Giddens in this respect, as Giddens attempted to understand how the global or modernity affects and influences individual and group security, or what Giddens, relying on Lund, terms ontological insecurity or security. So my own and others' interest and development of ontological security theory and studies, I think, developed in tandem with an increased attentiveness to work in IR on emotions and multiculturalism, on emotions and radicalization of far right and radical Islam, on emotions, borders and populism, on emotions, psychoanalysis, gender and masculinism, and on the emotional dynamics of post-colonial politics, not least in relation to migration and authoritarian governance. So a particular focus of this literature in IR has been on memory, crisis, and trauma as some kind of emotional context in which sites of effective investment arises, manifest in governments, as well as political and other leaders' responses to critical events. For instance, September 11, pandemics, white supremacy, climate change, more recently the wars in Ukraine and Gaza. But I also think that an increasing body of work has also focused on these critical moments from more of a bottom-up perspective, how emotional governance affect everyday politics, referring to how actors shape and are shaped by emotions at the individual, group, and societal levels through the mobilization and sometimes manipulation of everyday insecurities and or grievances, how insecurities, not least gendered insecurities, drive inequality, social injustice, and violence, and how such insecurities are related to neoliberal politics, to affective economies, and to hybrid media. And I think this is also where I see some of the more interesting big steps or blind spots in current theorizing, steps that remain perhaps under-theorized or underexplored at both the theoretical and empirical level. So what I think we need is an IR that takes seriously theoretical understandings of how emotions, conscious and unconscious, work differently depending on both context and level of analysis. One that allows for qualitative, discursive, narrative methodologies and for a broader empirical inclusion of studies and examples beyond American and Western realities. So in that sense, I think it's a call for a more inclusive, relational, post-positivist agenda that accounts for these gendered, racialized, unconscious, and other structural dynamics that affect the emotional dimension of politics. And I stop there. Thank you very much.
Fantastic. Right on time. Thanks, Katarina, for this interesting sharing those interesting insights from your own work. And I will move over to Erica then.
Thank you, Simon, for organizing the handbook, also for putting together this conversation across borders and multiple time difference zones, which I am very surprised that we are almost reaching close to 100 people watching us. So thank you all. And I enjoyed this conversation because first, I feel that I'm coming a little bit late into this debate on the emotional turn, because where do I come from? Well, I first got interested in doing research on memory and trauma, more specifically how traumatic events shape our understanding of global politics and make us do things and act politically. And it was through the work of, unfortunately, our late friend, colleague, Emma Hutchinson on affective communities that allow me to try to make sense of things that I was sniffing around in issue regarding memory and trauma, but never actually was able to conceptually and theorize and connect those threads. So the way she framed affective communities and allow me to get into a conversation to look into the role of emotion, circulation, emotion, and affect into my own work on memory and trauma. So I was able through that conversation incorporate this emotional affective dimension into my work on memory trauma. And more specifically, I'm very much interested to understand how traumatic events make internalized feelings of shame, hate, trust, distrust, resentment, and anxiety, and make us act politically. So more recently, I was able to, and that's the contribution of my chapter to the handbook, is into an understanding of how the colonial project, how the experience of coloniality was able to impact and make nations and peoples in the global south internalize the sentiment and feeling of shame. And so in this way, we internalize sense of inferiority, not being able or not being the legitimation of the colonial subject into power politics and the global politics. So this is where I come from and what I'm particularly interested to. But trying to integrate the research or the discussions around the role of emotions and affect more also allowed me to try to make sense of a recent phenomena, or not that recent, but became an unescapable phenomenon, so to speak, which is populism and far right. And here in the national context of Brazil, I was particularly interested to understand how Bolsonarismo as a political and populist movement came about so fast out of nowhere, and also to make sense of how the platform and the campaign of Bolsonaro played on resentment towards leftists in general and the threat of a communist threat in Brazil, and allowed him not only to reach and the presidency and to still animate how we think nowadays in our domestic politics. So I think the emotional turn has some interesting insights to understand the emergence of a so-called global or transnational far right and populist political parties and leaders and movements globally. Um, well, and to look into or try to understand pinpoint some of the gaps of blind spots in the literature so far. First, I have to say that the emotional turn is ready and ripe for being decolonized. I'm pretty much by now a little fed up into reading lots of interesting empirical work, mostly focusing on experience in the global north. So I think it's time we took it to the challenge of decolonizing, the debate on an emotion. So I'm now very interested, and Katarina and I, we share a standing group at the European International Studies Association for the upcoming next 2 years. And I was very happy when we were able to organize not one, two, but close to three panels, fully formed of 5 papers, all with interesting empirical work on affective and emotional experience outside the global north, so more directly into global south experiences. So I'm taking myself the challenge here in South America to try to popularize and consolidate the emotional turn in IR. Because up until, I don't know, 3 years ago, there was only me and Paula Sandrin who actually do work, and we pretty much review and critique each other work. So I took into the challenge of let's try to expand and show our colleagues in the IR community, not only in Brazil, but in the rest of South America, that the emotional term has some interesting insights about global politics. So I think the blind spot that at least myself I'm interested in pursuing is to take the emotional term beyond experiences in the global north and try to consolidate and expand our own understanding here in the global south of what is traditionally considered the stuff of IR, which in my understanding is still very much narrowly defined in terms of interests of states in a world of anarchy, and we're trying to escape the imprisonment of the state as this huge category and trying to make sense of how affective communities could also be an interesting concept to look into, how emotions and affects circulate and allows us to do things politically. And that's it.
Thanks, Erica. And Andrew, you're next.
Yeah, thank you so much. Thanks, Simon, for organizing this, and great to see everybody and the strong attendance. So, I'll say so. I have a little bit less to say on question one. The question, how has the emotional turn shaped your own thinking? I feel like it's been sort of part and parcel of my research since the beginning, since my doctoral work in the early 2000s. So, um, I share, I think, maybe some of Katarina's skepticism about the turns, as an organizing sort of apparatus, but it obviously serves a purpose as well. So, I think I'll move to the second question, which was about conceptual, methodological, and empirical contributions of emotion research to IR. And I'll just say something on levels of analysis because I think it's conceptual, it's methodological, and it's empirical. One of the questions that I've heard others ask of me and those engaged in research on emotions in IR is sort of a version of, um, huh, emotions in international politics. Whose emotions are we talking about, though? And then often followed by some distinction between individuals and groups, right? Elites and masses, leaders, and groups, diplomats and experts versus ordinary mass publics and so forth. And I used to struggle with the question a little bit since my own more sociological and cultural approach to emotions sort of cut across those conventional levels. But I think it's telling that it's in international relations that we feel that question, that question has special salience in international relations where we're interested in so many different kinds of actors, states, institutions, leaders, publics, and so forth. It's in that context that whose emotions question feels pressing. And I think it's sort of haunted in a productive way. It's sort of animated and haunted the research on emotions in IR. And so instead of installing ourselves at one level and then studying emotions as causal variables that have some kind of ontological affinity at that level, or affinity to behaviors and interactions at one level. Scholars have instead looked at processes and practices that cut across levels and introduced a variety of concepts to facilitate those innovations, whether it's identification, contagion, circulation, and so forth. Um, so emotions are, I think, inherently kind of multi-level, if not trans-level. And so we can talk about fear at the level of national publics or even as a relational property of relations among states and other corporate actors. But our analytical interest in fear as an emotion always sort of brings us back to human bodies and the need to think through um, exactly how those broader patterns are created out of something that implicates actual people. Um, and so that's kind of what I have to say on levels. I'm happy to sort of think more about that and entertain questions and other thoughts. On the third question, Simon asked about next big steps. I think one big challenge that both Erica and Katarina have already mentioned, relates to the rise of populist movements and regimes on the right. I'm trying to think through this in a project that Simon alluded to with Ty Solomon on, the emotional contestation over the liberal international order. And I think the post-World War II order is underpinned by sometimes implicit sentiments relating to trust through diplomacy, humanitarian compassion, guilt associated with wartime conduct, and so forth. And of course, these are contested and they're plural, but I think for the sake of argument, we could sort of think about a set of even a set of feeling rules to invoke the idea that the sociologist Arlie Hochschild um, uh, develops. Feeling rules associated with the liberal international order. And then I think that raises the question of sort of how emotions are being contested in about the last decade, and how those liberal feeling rules are being subject to growing resistance and contestation. And so groups on the right have leveraged social media, online forums, and other mediums to kind of test out those rival feeling rules, often with a focus on various nativist fears. And this, I think, has a very specific history and trajectory that can be located empirically. I think the COVID pandemic is a salient reference point as the restrictions related to public health quickly gave rise to perceptions that international authorities were, imposing restrictions in a way that undermined national sovereignty. The refugee crisis in the early and middle 2010s, especially in the European context, gave rise to a series of efforts to develop new standards relating to migration. This, I think, then catalyzed a series of anxieties and kind of pushback against some of those liberal principles. Now, as we know, from various work on international authority and conservative ideologies, a lot of these concerns have existed for a long time, and so one of the challenges is kind of figuring out what are the, what is new about this more recent context, what social and material conditions are allowing popular emotions to coalesce into potentially rival feeling rules at the transnational level. And so I won't answer those questions, but I think there's two kind of aspects that are quite interesting. One relates to technology. As new technologies are facilitating the transnational expression of these countervailing sentiments, I think it's sort of incumbent on us to understand how those processes work. And I think, we have a quite robust sort of conceptual frameworks for understanding the ways in which emotions kind of co-evolve with social processes and social structures, whether it's protest activities or bureaucratic institutions, social networks, and so forth. But emotions also co-evolve within specific material contexts and co-evolve with specific material or technological affordances. And so I think in the 21st century, a big challenge lies in understanding how those technologies, whether it's algorithms or now AI enabled algorithms, are shaping political emotions and facilitating that contestation over liberal feeling rules. The second and this will be the last point I make, is the growing salience of what I call popular emotion. And this sort of goes back to some work from six or so years ago with Todd Hall, where we talked about popular emotion as a kind of artificial political construction that simplifies what is always a much richer and more diverse field of affective experience and simplifies it into a kind of a narrative of normalized emotions within a given space, often national space. And I think one key question in the present is how and why popular emotion, how the idea that we can and should make claims about how the people are feeling has become such a common feature in populist discourse. Leaders and pundits and influencers and so forth are busier than ever telling us how people ought to feel. Don't fear COVID, but do fear immigrants. Don't feel compassion for these people or those people over there. Do feel compassion for these people. Don't feel pride in woke principles, but do feel pride in white identity or some other cultural marker. And so in each case, I think these are not just competing emotional interests. They're being presented in a way that normalizes and humanizes a very specific set of emotional responses and designates others as unnatural or corrupt or deviant. And so I think we still haven't fully come to terms with why emotions are so integral to those contestations. So anyway, I have a few other thoughts on that, but I'll leave it there and I look forward to questions.
Right, thanks, Andrew. I'm sure we're going to dive into that later on. Some of the points you raised quite fascinating. So I'll finish this line of speakers, and then we'll open the floor for more questions. I see already two in the chat, so feel free to drop us some more questions in the chat or raise your hand once we're starting with the discussion. So thank you again. I'm also very excited to be part of this panel. And I want to echo something that Katarina already mentioned. So the emotional turn obviously is a nice label, but as you rightly said, it has been there all along in IR. You mentioned, of course, a couple of people in foreign policy analysis in the 60s and 70s and 80s. I would add to that also the feminist work in the 80s and 90s, which took emotion center stage. So I think what we may have been doing with the emotional turn is probably just making or introducing emotions more explicitly as a category of analysis in IR. Not to mention that it wasn't there all along. That's for sure. But perhaps more implicitly and more hidden as a concept, a hidden concept, as Felix Behrenskötter would probably call this. So for me personally, the emotional turn, if you want to call it that, has fundamentally reshaped, in fact, how I think about IR, and in a sense also of how I view emotions. So to me, emotions are not just simply private experiences or individual psychological states. They are a social and political force that structures how international actors perceive threats, make decisions, and negotiate norms, legitimacy, and identities. And one way to conceptualize this is what I've been doing with emotional communities, so groups of actors, institutions, and publics who share, regulate, and contest over emotional and affective orientations. And believe that thinking in terms of emotional communities, so I looked at NATO, the European Union, but you can also look at states in terms of emotional communities, but also non-state actors like social movements and NGOs. Thinking in terms of those emotional communities helps us, I think, understand how those emotional patterns are sustained, mobilized, and contested, and also how they help navigate actors in the international arena and how they influence decision-making, normative change, and international cooperation in ways that many traditional approaches, I think, often overlook. So conceptually, I think emotion research has shown in IR that emotions are actually constitutive of political life. So they shape perceptions of threat and legitimacy, mediate expectations, and also influence how both leaders, publics, any kind of global actors interpret world events. And I think one particular relevant point to this that I've been also looking into was the methodological work, because that was used to be one of the big hurdles and obstacles in studying emotions in our art. How can we even measure or trace emotions in international political life? And so in my approach, I used a lot of discourse and narrative analysis as well as ethnographic approaches. And I know a lot of my colleagues have done this as well here in this panel. And this has enabled us actually to trace emotional meaning making in diplomatic interactions and a lot of international debates. And empirically, the study of emotions, to me at least, demonstrates that collective effect. So emotions and affect at the collective level is in fact socially regulated within emotional communities, and that these shared feeling rules that exist in these emotional communities, something which Andrew already mentioned, matter profoundly, that they can drive conflict escalation and de-escalation, that they can shape alliances or destroy them, and they can enforce or challenge international norms. So looking ahead, I see several promising research frontiers that still remain underexplored, and I think that aligns nicely with what has been said so far. So I think one important direction concerns the micropolitical foundations of emotional communities. So how everyday effective practices sustain or contest the emotional governments of the state or state-like communities. So while we know states use emotional narratives to maintain legitimacy, for example, in war fighting or in political elections, I think we know far less about the moments when citizens resist, reinterpret, or challenge these official emotional meanings, so-called official emotional meanings. And a lot of this is something I look at in a research project in a larger collaboration with other scholars from Berlin in affective societies in a project on affective contestation. And what we look at is how different social movements, both from the right and left, contest the emotional repertoires and emotional official emotions of the European Union, and that are being articulated in the public arena and the public space. And I'm happy to talk more about this later, but I want to just briefly talk about two more avenues that I think are quite relevant, or could be relevant in terms of future directions for emotion research. So a second avenue, I think, lies in deepening the link between emotions and international practices. There has been some work being done on practice theory and emotions. but I think there could be more. So practice theory has already highlighted how routines, embodied know-how, and shared expectations give stability to world politics. And ontological security studies is a large and big pile of that. But I think it has yet to fully integrate this emotional dimension that underpins these practices. How emotions shape the intensity of commitments, the durability of shared dispositions, and the ways actors perform diplomatic or security practices. And the third direction involves situating emotions within global historical processes. So while IR scholarship has made a lot of progress on identity, race, and gender, and basically situating and contextualizing it in historical terms, it has rarely traced how emotions, emotional norms, and expressions evolve and develop over time, and how they shape major transformations such as decolonization, populism, or humanitarianism. So historicizing emotions or emotional communities would allow us to see more how feeling will change over time, and how emotions structure political orders, and also how they brought them down, and how past emotional regimes continue to shape contemporary world politics. And with that, I think I'll stop to give to open the floor for more questions and comments. I see already four in the chat. No, there's four in the chat and five oh, there's two actually. So there's a question Q&A section and there's a chat section. So okay, not to get confused there. So we have 9 questions already. I will first of all, I want to thank all the speakers for their great input so far, and I will just go ahead and maybe collect some of the questions that we see so far. So Kashab, for example, please correct me if I mispronounce your names. I'm really terrible with that. So if I mispronounce it, but do call me out. So Kashab says wants to know if there are common patterns and differences between entanglements of emotions and politics in majority world and global north. And I think Asha's comment goes in the same direction. So do you think for decolonization of IR it would be necessary to decolonize education first? This is an interesting point, something we haven't talked about so far. So how we teach emotions in international relations. I know a lot of us are doing this already. Then there's a question from the audience. If Thucydides identified fear, honor, and interest as the populist emotional drivers of state behavior, why has the systematic study on the role of emotions in IR lagged so far behind other analytical traditions? That's an interesting question. Thank you for that. Then we have a question from the Philippines, where emotions in IR research is very much in its infancy. Well, I can attest to that. The same is true for Germany as well. I'm working on my doctoral project, and they want to know incorporating indigenous psychology, local concepts, and emotion words. What do you think about indigenous knowledge approaches as a way to expand and maybe also decolonize emotions in our research? I think that's a great question as well. Then this is for Erica and me. Do you believe that using a decolonized or localized language will be beneficial for studying emotions in IR, particularly in the context of post-colonial states? And what other ways can we decolonize the discourse surrounding emotions in IR? And then there's Rebecca from Toronto, and she's having a question on methodology. Do you have any suggestions for studying emotions as a causal variable? How can we incorporate a more positivist methodology, and how can discourse analysis help inform hypothesis and be studied through process traits? Yeah. So these are just some of the questions. They raised a lot on decolonization and I think global IR, but also on methodology. Maybe you guys want to start with that first round and then move on to the next pile of questions. Great. So who wants to go first? Any volunteers? Otherwise, we'll just go in the order that we started. Erica, is that a hand? Yeah, go ahead. Go ahead. Yeah, please.
Yes, I can, since I have been the target of some of the issues and questions raised, especially regarding the colonization of IR or the study of emotions in IR. Um, First of all, I want to start by saying that I was deeply impacted by an article I read about 2, 3 years ago on West planning and Russian planning, especially regarding all the controversy of, how to understand and make sense of the war in Ukraine. And in this article, I think it came out, it actually even got an award, like Best Article of the Year, I think Contemporary Security Studies or some, so I can't exactly recall the name of the journal. But anyhow, it started by saying, be aware of Nick from Connecticut. Who is Nick from Connecticut? That grad student or early scholar coming from the north, going to the south and trying to use the south at its own laboratory to test hypotheses and theories elaborated in the north. So be aware of Nick from Connecticut coming into your home. And that image stuck with me so strongly because I did my whole life training as a scholar here in Brazil. And there was a parade of Nicks from Connecticut from all over the place in the last, I don't know, 20 years I've been in the field. And I think so I approached the notion of, or the challenge of decolonizing IR, not only the emotional turn IR as a whole, being aware of Nicks from Connecticut coming to Brazil to test their theories and hypotheses, and then going back and just using us as this footnote on their papers and books. So the first thing therefore I recommend, and I do that and I apply that in my practice in my institution, is to try to locate and hear and read voices from my Brazil talking about problems in Brazil and trying to make sense from the way we think about Brazil and reflect about Brazil. And in a way, what I try to do, especially when now I'm trying to open up and assign readings outside scholarly or canonical IR literature, but above all, trying to find and assign um, local and national writers, not specifically political scientists of IR scholars. Sometimes some of the best insights that I have on problems around international security or militarization here in Brazil, I got them from reading playwrights. I think playwrights and authors in general have a window into the soul of people. And so I approach the way I do research is being aware of Nicks from Connecticut, and above all, trying to locate sometimes a concept or an analogy or a representation that not necessarily come from those canonical texts in IR, but not assigning them or treating them as this huge hierarchy of knowledge, and trying to locate voices and words and concepts from outside, but from my context, from my national or regional context. So, so in a way, yes, that's my first step, I think, in trying to decolonize how I teach and think about international relations to begin with. Uh, um, and now I'm trying to talk about Aaron's note about his doing work in the Philippines and his doctoral research. I use local concepts all the time, and I borrow them from even from Brazilian soap operas writers, because again, if they are able to offer you a glimpse, sometimes a quote that opens up a way of thinking differently about old problems, why not? So this is why, for example, when I wrote the chapter on the colonial memo, the traumatic memory around the colonial experience and how it affects foreign policy and emotions and internalization of shame and inferiority. That insight came from reading a very famous sports commentators for around soccer, football in Brazil. But he talked about how Brazil wishes sometimes to lose big games and championships in soccer because they actually think that they're not able or it had as the status to being a winner and beat, for example, Germany. So he talks about the mongrel complex, how Brazilians act and place themselves voluntarily in an inferior category. And at the same time, they resent that inferiority, but they are also always trying to enact and establish for itself, Brazilians for itself, for the nation, as being an equal. So that allowed me to think about, that makes sense to explain, for example, Brazil's obsession in obtaining a permanent seat at the UN Security Council and Brazilian foreign policy in the last 60 years or so. So I'm not at all ashamed of getting some of the insights us outside Brazil's international relations scholarship, not at all. And I think we are able, if we open ourselves to hear and read about our own eyes, thinking about our own problems, thinking different about the same troubles that has been ghosting us for forever, sometimes that would actually help us to advance a little bit in trying to decolonize knowledge in Brazil. So again, be aware of Nick's the Connecticut's out there that tries to place upon us this role of being their laboratory for theories and concepts.
Excellent. So, Katarina, you want to add to that, or Andrew, anyone?
I could add just on the decolonial or post-colonial or what we would like to. I mean, for me, it comes back again to to the terms. I think, I mean, one way of describing the terms in IR is to call it the ontological insecurity of the discipline, because I think that's what IR often tries to do. And I think one of the things that happens then is that you forget. I mean, you don't only forget there's so much work on the sociology of emotions. There's so much work on I mean, if we think of post-colonial, I mean, I work on India, which is, of course, the context of a lot of post-colonial studies. But, a lot of these authors, if we think of Fanon, if we think of Stuart Hall, or if we think of, the kind of origins of kind of, emotions work within sociology, I think has in some sense failed to come into IR, directly at least, So I think it's also about widening, our decolonize is also recognizing that there has already been a lot of work. There's already been a lot of authors who have dealt with this. I mean, who has a psychoanalytical foundation, Fanon, for instance, it's a very strong psychoanalytical dimension of this work that was Sarah Ahmed, for instance. There are so many people that we don't think of always as being in IR, but would mean so much. If we are really serious about decolonizing, we also need to recognize the work that's been done in other disciplines and bring that into IR and not be always having to carve out IR as if it was a very specific field that, is kind of not relying on all the other disciplines. So that's what I would just add to the kind of decolonization or post-colonial debate. Thanks.
Lund, thank you. Andrew, you want to chip in as well?
Sure. I mean, there's a number of questions that I'd love to try to answer. I don't know how much time I'll have, but so there's a question from Nilu Salimi on saying more about growing popular emotion. I mean, I probably didn't present this very clearly because we had limited time, but I actually think it's not so much growing popular emotion because I think the idea of popular emotion has a much longer and deeper history. And so I think what's interesting is to sort of think about like under what historical conditions does an appeal to popular emotion become pressing or relevant? And I sort of think, I mean, for a different project, I was rereading Hobbes's Leviathan, right, recently, and thinking about the way in which, his account sort of naturalizes fear as the unifying emotional language of civil society. And so, in this moment of civil unrest, this sort of transitional moment, the appeal to this kind of naturalized emotional response serves a kind of valuable role in kind of anchoring institutions and in his case, sort of underpinning the image of the state of nature and the alternative to civil society. Um, but I've the piece where I looked at this with Todd Hall, talked about World War I and the idea of war enthusiasm. And so I think there are these sort of historical moments where the appeal to popular emotion and the effort to impute or attribute emotions to aggregate populations becomes politically, powerful and relevant. On the was the other question? Oh, the Thucydides question. I mean, no need to apologize. I think that in some cases, so the questioner, this was an anonymous question. Um, I'm new to this topic, so please excuse my ignorance. I mean, I actually, maybe this feeds a little bit into or amplifies some of the things that Katarina said. I actually think like we need more ignorance. Like we need, because a lot of the work on emotions necessitates kind of unlearning some of the sort of typologies and the theoretical frameworks that we've inherited in the discipline of IR. And I think what I said initially about levels of analysis to me is just kind of one like reference point that has involved sort of unlearning this major sort of organized analytical and ontological sort of organizing framework that predominant, that defines sort of Cold War international relations. Um, but I think absolutely Thucydides talks about fear, honor, and interest, and so forth. And so too do many earlier thinkers who are also often cited in international relations. I mean, Hobbes would be one, but we could also go back, I think, to the so-called classical realist thinkers in the middle part of the early and middle 20th century, who were writing at a time when the sort of the theoretical or the kind of ontological and methodological restrictions associated with the behavioralist revolution had not taken hold, and so they're thinking very holistically about multidimensional political behavior. They're talking about the interplay between identities at the level of the state and the sort of personalities and emotional expressions of leaders. They're not sort of policing their analytical movement across those distinctions. And I think those are productive resources. And the Thucydides, who I haven't read in a very long time, presumably would be another such resource. So I don't want to take up more time. I think there's a question there about the WTO and another one about the International Criminal Court, just as examples. Um, but maybe others, Simon, you may have. I think we need to leave time for you as well.
Thanks, Andrew. But I'd love to hear more about the popular emotions that you raised. But I think this is going to come out at some point in published version, I'm sure. Yeah, I'll just quickly take up some of the questions that have been raised so far, and I'll just start with the questions on decolonization and local concepts of emotions, and the one that Althea and Aaron, for example, raised. And I would just, about how to incorporate indigenous psychologies, local concepts, and also the how to decolonize the discourse surrounding emotions in R. And I would strongly encourage you guys to really bring this into bring more empirical studies of emotions and emotional contexts. Also, feeling rules, for example, is a good example of how much variation there is throughout the world on on the norms, the gendered norms, or the political norms on emotions, and how we view them and debate them in different contexts is incredibly different. And I think here we can learn a lot from anthropology, where that has been, where research on indigenous emotions and emotions from non-Western regions has debunked long-standing Western myths of how we see and view emotions or emotional expressions. And I think we need a lot more of that in the IR as well, right? More studies from other emotional contexts other than our familiar Western contexts, or familiar to some of them, to some of us at least. So I would strongly encourage to go down that road more. On the states using emotional narratives, that question by Nilu, if I pronounce that correctly, I think it's an obvious way of how states exercise or implement power and legitimacy in international relations. I mean, obvious example is the national holidays and pride and how flag raising and singing the national anthem and how all that feeds into the solidarity and the cohesion, social cohesion of the state and the legitimacy of the state. But what I find much more interesting is how those narratives, those official emotional narratives of the state, can also marginalize and discriminate against certain groups, right? So I remember writing an article on the terrorist attacks in Berlin, and the way the state used emotional narratives of solidarity and looking forward, having a positive view on how we stand strong against this disaster, and we will get through this together and all that. And appeals to collective strength and sacrifice, and completely marginalized the voices of those people who were grieving their lost ones in the terrorist attacks. They were completely sidelined in that emotional narratives. But they wouldn't take it. They wouldn't have it. So they kind of contested these emotional narratives by the German state back then, and they openly questioned, whether this was the right way of dealing with this terrorist attacks. So what I'm saying is, the emotional narrative of the state, while it's forceful and can lead to a lot of social cohesion and solidarity, and this is obviously an important function of emotional narratives, also in terms of achieving political legitimacy, it can also at the same time marginalize and discriminate against certain groups that don't necessarily feel, being part of that particular emotional narrative. And I think with that, I'll stop, because right now it's 6 p.m. So I think, if I'm not mistaken, we've reached the end of this fantastic virtual panel. So I want to give a quick round of applause to everyone who joined in this panel. We're really fast. I'm really happy that we had such a large crowd, such a large turnout. I want to say thank you to our speakers, Katarina, Erica, and Andrew, for joining us. This was incredibly insightful, and I look forward to keeping the conversation going in the future. And also to all these fantastic questions. We didn't have the chance to answer them all, but at least speaking for me, you can always drop me an email if there's more need, or if you have the time or want to engage more in works on emotions. So I'll be happy to engage more with that. So, and hopefully see you in person at some of the ISA and other conferences that are coming up. So thank you again.